Today we are going to be meeting with Amanda Young and Michael Azzarani, and they will be talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and some cultural adaptations and considerations for doing psychotherapeutic treatment with population. So my name is Samantha Hinnenkamp, and I'm one of the SAS SEC co-chairs.
And my name is Betsy Varner. I am the other co-chair for the SEC pillar of our SAS division.
Mm-hmm. And we are members of Ball State University. We're going to be hosting the Student Affiliates of 17 chapter for just another few months, and then it will be starting over at the University of Missouri-Columbia. The purpose of SAS is to be a student organization for counseling psychology students. Mm-hmm. So to get us started, I'm going to briefly introduce Amanda Young. Amanda Young is currently a member of MHA Nation from Fort Berthold Reservation in Newtown, North Dakota. And she is also a community member of Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in Belcourt, North Dakota. She went to Turtle Mountain Community College and received her associate's degree. She also played basketball while she was there. She moved to the University of North Dakota, where she completed her bachelor's as well as her master's degree. And currently she's a first-year counseling psychology doctoral student at Oklahoma State University, living with her husband and their fur baby, Stuart.
Okay, and I'm going to be introducing Michael Azzarani. So Michael is a proud Mexica currently completing his second year of the doctoral training in the counseling psychology program at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Michael received his master's in professional counseling from the University of Oklahoma in 2015 and received his bachelor's in music and psychology from Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. Michael's professional interests include Indigenous psychology and sociopolitical positionality, racial justice, multicultural counseling, and critical race theory. Upon completing his doctoral training, Michael hopes to work closely with his Indigenous community in both academic and clinical settings. We are really excited to have Michael and Amanda with us today, and we're so glad that they have agreed to share the knowledge that they have about this really important topic. So just a few housekeeping things. You'll note on your Zoom page here that there's a couple features down at the bottom. So these are features that you can use to help interact during our presentation. So at the bottom, you will see a chat and Q&A feature. Feel free to type in any questions that you have for Michael and Amanda throughout the presentation, and we will leave some time for the end of the presentation to go over those questions. All right, Michael and Amanda, take it away.
Hi, so I'll be starting this out with our presentation with just a really awesome quote, for lack of better terms, that I found while we were doing the literature and different things like that. So this is the main quote, and it basically states the primary message that we're trying to get across throughout the whole presentation that we'll be doing today. And so this quote is from Lafron Boyce, Trembles, and Mohat from 1990. It talks about the knowledge of and respect of Native American worldview and value system. And I intentionally bolded which varies across to the client's tribe, level of acculturation, and other personal characteristics. Is fundamental not only for creating and trusting counselor-client relationship, vital to helping process, but also for defining the counseling style or approach most appropriate for each client. So that being said, I really want to be very mindful and very purposeful of this talk and state right away that we are not in any way, shape, or form speaking for all Native populations. We are Native identity, and we also identify with Native culture, but we do not speak for all Native people. What we're going to be presenting about today is just like a combination of all the literature that we came across, and also just some basic housekeeping things that new clinicians and clinicians that are already established should know about working with Native populations. So that just jumps right into my next slide, which is cultural considerations and understanding the acculturation differences. I have another slide that has way more information on that. But basically that there are over 500 federally recognized tribes within the United States. That's not saying that they're also accounting for the federally unrecognized tribes. There are thousands upon thousands of different tribal nations within Turtle Island, and I'm also going to hone in on the point that this does not over-encompass all Native peoples. As well as I'll be doing a good snapshot of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is what the acronym of MMIW stands for. Specifically, we're talking about statistics, sexual trauma prevention, and non-Native clinicians working with Native clients, because this is something that we really have to be mindful as we go along with this talk. So here's just conversation about what acculturation differences look like. So from the literature from Laframboise, Trimble, and Mowat, actually from 1990, they recognize 5 different acculturation differences and the different levels that happens with that. So the first one would be traditional, those who speak their native language and also know like a little bit of English, but they really adhere to their old time. That's a colonial way of saying that they just adhere to their actual values that their people have from the start. There's also transitional, marginal, bicultural, and assimilated. Transitional, they generally speak both English and their native language, as well as the native language within the home. So they're able to transition in between both the worlds. Marginal, these individuals may be defensively Indian. They don't really like that, but they're unable to live in the cultural heritage of the tribal group and identify with the dominant society. So they don't like being identified as Native American or Indian individuals. They like to be outside of their tribal affiliation and work out there. Bicultural, those are the individuals, for the most part, they're accepted by dominant society, yet they're able to accept their tribal traditions and cultures, and they can move in either direction. Not with fluidity, there is some challenges that come with that, but for the most part, they do it fairly well. And assimilated, these are individuals who have in no part accepted any part of their native identity, and they just live within the dominant culture.
Amanda, I'm so sorry to interrupt. The audience is having trouble seeing the slides.
I don't know what to do.
Yes.
See.
We're still seeing the Google Drive main page.
Huh.
What?
I wonder if you stop sharing the screen for a second and then try it again, if it might just kind of reset there.
Up there at the top.
Up here at the top.
At the wheel,
This one?
it says stop share.
Oh,
Okay.
share again.
Perfect. And then we also had an audience member note that it would help if the blinds were shut. And so I'm sorry to have you doing double duty, Michael. Would you mind shutting the blinds as well?
Sure. Where do I click it, Amanda?
That one.
This one right here?
Over.
That one.
Over.
That one.
Right there. Okay.
How's that?
We've got slide screens.
Okay.
So thank you.
Awesome. Funny enough, the blinds are already shut.
Blinds are shut.
Oh no.
I wish we had some curtains. Well, I wonder if we can.
Well,
I'm going to be novel. Think outside the box. We have this lovely thing.
Does that
all
work?
right. That would help for sure. The one side, definitely.
Is this helping a little bit?
It's definitely got the one window. Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to do about this one.
I think we'll just continue on. We've done the best we could. You're doing great, and it's gonna work now. So thank you.
Okay. So you guys understand acculturation? Okay. So moving forward, so missing and murdered Indigenous women. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is MMIW, and it's a grassroots movement that is going on all across Turtle Island. And it's basically us fighting back, us bringing awareness and shining light onto the discrepancies and the epidemic that is happening within Indian country. So this is, whenever I refer to MMIW, that's exactly what it is. It's missing and murdered Indigenous women and the movement to help make sure that our women and sisters are safe. So here are some statistics. 84% of Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 56% of Native women are survivors of sexual assault. For Native American women and girls, sexual violence is expected early in life, with an estimated 54% of rapes occurring before the age of 12. Now, I don't know about you guys, but most 12-year-olds, they only have to worry about like what kind of shoes they're gonna get, or like what's the new game they're gonna buy. not necessarily having to worry about their sexual safety, making sure that their bodies are not taken advantage of and violated, or that they're taken from their homes to be exploited for sexual exploitation. Native American women and girls comprises of 50% of individuals in sex trafficking businesses within the United States. And that was a statistic just as recent as 2016. Native women are murdered at 10 times the national average rate, more than any other race. And I cannot stress these statistics enough, because in America, Native people only consumed a small percentage of people within the United States. And for our population to be getting such high statistics, it's astronomical. It's extremely problematic. And also, homicide is the third leading cause of death among Native women and girls between the ages of 10 and 24. Oh, sorry, I get really emotional when I read these. And unfortunately and saddeningly enough, there's not a definite number of how many women and girls are missing, murdered, or forced into sexual trades or sex trafficking, because people are not documenting this, which also contributes to the lack of advocacy and justice that we feel as Native people. We are continuing to die. As of just recently, I know of a Native woman within Montana who was declared missing. That was just within the last couple of days, and nobody is having these conversations and nobody's talking about it, which is what prompted this conversation to have with you guys, so that you guys are able to be aware of this. So, missing and murdered Indigenous women. How do we come across this as a clinician point of view, as a colonialized clinician point of view? So a lot of what I'm going to say is stuff that you might not understand unless you identify with Native traditions and that you work within your spiritual self as well. So whenever we come across sexual assault, sexual trauma with a Native woman or Native girl, we have to have this conversation about what it's like having your spirit invaded and having a huge part of your spirit taken out and being replaced with negativity. Now, that in itself is a very powerful conversation to have. To be able to sit across from someone who survived being raped, who survived being taken, to have that conversation of your spirit was once whole and now there's parts of it that are toxic for you and it's not your fault. This was put onto you. So having that conversation in itself is very impactful, and I think it could help you understand, well, I mean, me in a particular way, I think it would help me understand how I connect with the earth that I was put on, as well as the experiences that happened to me because I'm a Native woman. Having that conversation about pieces being taken out of your spirit and having negative spirit notions come into it, as well as reclaiming the narrative of what it's like to have your spirit taken from you, like chunks of it. If this is like a spirit, I'm taking chunks of it, a big ass chunk. Taking chunks out of it and having someone fill it with hurt and pain and all these other things that we don't know how to cope with because our spirit didn't have that to begin with. So reclaiming the narrative, giving the opportunity for your survivor, victim in front of you, your client, to take a step back and take what they need to be able to be whole again is very important. As well as working with the negative spirit. So your spirit as a whole, it's hard to be like, oh, we're just going to ignore the negative side of our spirit. No, it's a part of your whole spirit. It's a part of the whole you and who you are as a being. So how do we work with the negative part of who we are as a being? Which is very complicated. I could just feel like people like, was she talking about spirits? But for the most part, this is how we have to adapt our language and how we are as beings to be the most effective way to bring healing for these individuals. So how do we address the negative spirit as well as also nurture the quote unquote like healthy, positive spirit that we were born with? Which, to be completely honest with you, the literature doesn't really tell us how to do that. And I don't think that it ever would, because this is the concept that a lot of colonialism does not understand. And it's kind of hard to publish stuff like that when we have colonial individuals who are reviewing it and doing things like that. But I know from my tradition and from where I'm from, how we would address the negative part of the spirit to help it become whole, because we can't take the whole negative part out. That's not reality, but we can start healing it and making sure that the majority of the negative part that's impacting our life the most is healing. So how do we do that? With collaboration, working with your client, working with the individual who's in front of you, figuring out what they need to be able to be healthy, as well as doing some empowerment, reminding them that they are survivors, reminding them that we can work forward so that this does not happen to you again. What can we do to make sure that you're safe, make sure that your daughter, your son, etc. is safe? How can we make sure that the community is safe so that this stuff does not happen to other individuals, different things like that. Which brings me into my next topic, which would be prevention. Talking within the community, what does the community need? And I know that might be hard for some individuals who have education, who go through the modality of like learning and different things like that, of what that looks like by going into the community and asking what the community needs, as opposed to going into the community telling them what they need. There's a very big distinction between the two, and it's very intentional that I make that distinction. There are differences. But the main thing is going into the community, figuring out what the community needs, asking the elders within the community, asking the community members what they need to make sure that this does not happen to their community members. And that could be a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to necessarily be therapy. It doesn't necessarily have to be research. It could also just be being a part of the community that can make change. As well as programming. We need more programming, and this is how we do it, is through advocacy, through our platforms within academia, putting together the programming so that we can prevent different things. Education programming for community members, for tribal enforcement, for tribal leaders, for states, for so that there's this connection between the tribe and also state entities so that they're able to work together to make sure that this is going well. And also awareness and advocacy. You being able to listen to this conversation, watch this talk that we're doing, is a part of being part of the change. It's a part of being aware and also working towards how can we make sure that this population is safe in the future, as well as working with an action research. So there's one thing doing research with this particular population, there's another thing of doing action research. So action research is basically you going in with the community, and the community is telling you what they need research done on. Not you being like, oh, I want to do this to make sure that this happens. No, that is you putting your agenda onto the community, as opposed to you working with the community and figuring out what they need from you with your colonial mindset to make sure that their community is safe. That's what action research is. And for the most part, that's all that I have to say about that. Okay, we're going to transition to Michael.
Hi there, everyone. So I am going to do my best to continue looking into this camera. We have a giant screen right in front of us. And so it's really tempting to want to look here and just make sure my hair looks good. But I'm going to be trying to focus in right here. All right. Amanda talked a lot about what adaptation is going to look like. And so I don't want to spend too much time belaboring a point, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the issues when it comes to thinking about adapting our colonial idea of what psychotherapy is, indeed our dominant idea of what psychotherapy is. So in my mind, the idea of this talk, adapting practice for Native communities, is a little bit of a misnomer, because truly the idea of simply making cosmetic changes to a psychotherapy is insufficient. And we're going to start talking about why here, with the idea of colonization via psychology, or psy-colonization. I cannot claim that. I stole it from Dr. Joseph Gahn, okay? And it's a fantastic idea. The psy-colonization of Native people. And we were lucky enough this past weekend to be able to not only dive into this literature a little bit more, but to speak with Native people in the field who are studying this exact thing. So a lot of what I want to do in this next piece is just kind of relate some of that wisdom to everybody, and hope that we can kind of plant a seed of understanding when it comes to what this concept of psy-colonization is. And that begins with the discussion of modernity and psychology as it extends out of this idea of modernity. And for those of you who may not have an understanding, and there very well may be those of you watching right now that know more about modernity than I even do, not that I know much about it, but I want to do my best to kind of explain what that is. And what we can think of it is kind of this period that extends from enlightenment, right? Where things, perspectives and philosophy began to emerge out of this disenchantment with the very spiritualized religious context that things were situated in. And so it's where we begin to view these spiritual aspects as suspicious, and we begin to move away from the traditions of the time and become more forward-looking, right? That extension of that enlightenment rationality. So as we begin to enter into this period of modernity, we become more rational thinking, we become more individualistic in our way of relating to ourselves and the people around us in the world. We begin to experience notions of a democracy where we promote these ideal of capitalism. And when I say that, I mean it in terms of that anything can be monetized. Indeed, even the land, which in many Native ways, particularly for my people's ways, is inseparably connected to my physical corporal body, right? So when we begin to talk about this monetization of what whiteness views as a resource for consumption, it is a literal consumption of my body, right, of my people's body. And so in this way, we kind of see how modernity kind of leads to that colonial idea of consumption and use, abuse, rape, holistically, when it comes, whether it's the rape of this physical body or the body of my sisters or my people, or the rape of our bodies vis-a-vis the land, right? So that also gives way to governmental entities, and that government plays this important role in the day-to-day life of individuals. Next slide. And so as we continue to expand on this idea of what modernity is, we understand from that rational extension and that individualistic extension that it's rooted very much in positivism, right? This idea of a capital T truth that we can look out into the world and see the natural order of things, or what this objective reality more so. We also see what extends from that positivism, the professionalization of human sciences, such as counseling, where we make it this business, this monetized thing, which is very different from more native ideas of what it is in terms of this idea of healing rooted in positivism. So we begin to take this rational approach to understanding and finding healing. And what that rational approach ultimately does is that it centralizes a Western way of knowing as what is legitimate, as what is objective, as what is truth. And what it does is it delegitimizes indigenous ways of knowing and positions our approach to understanding as savage, as stupid, as primitive, right? And so from that, we begin to experience this loss of tradition. And in the research that we began to look into, we see how a lot of Indigenous people's conceptualization, particularly those who experience their worlds traditionally or more traditionally, view the etiology of this dysfunction as not something that comes from this biomedical internal genetic space, but comes from the loss of ceremonial traditions, right? And when we disrupt those ceremonial traditions, we interrupt the relationships that we have with the Creator and obstruct our access to that life-generating sacred power. And that's how many natives in these spaces, in traditional spaces, and even in some urban spaces too, kind of view dysfunction. And this is a very, going back to Indigenous ways of understanding the etiology of what we would understand as mental health issues. So as we begin to talk about psychology as a product of modernity, we can see a little bit more clearly how the idea of psychotherapy begins to extend from this idea of rationalism and empiricism and scientific inquiry for how we justify the efficacy of our treatments. So one of those pieces is that psychotherapy presumes a Western self and personhood. Often critical race theorists have noted that white supremacy has interwoven itself into the structure of a society in such a way that these assumptions have become so innocuous, right? We experience them in the day-to-day interactions in the most innocuous ways. And so what become ultimately these cultural prescriptions or cultural assumptions interweave themselves so perniciously and completely that we take them as the default, right? And that's the same thing for psychotherapy. It's just kind of a given that we've not really questioned too much until recently, but it assumes a Western self and personhood. And what I mean when I say that is that we understand the self and a personhood, or a personhood rather, as this uniqueness or this autonomy, right? This self-autonomy with a richly developed internal sense of self and a strong, coherent sense of self-direction and aspiration to be happy, right? Those things may sound like, well, of course, everyone feels that way. However, it's important to recognize that no, those things stem from a really individualistic way of understanding the self. And that kind of flies in the face of traditional ancient forms of understanding when it comes to indigeneity. So this idea of personhood is very Western in its construction and its assumptions. And so then psychotherapy depends on this distinctive client capabilities and interests. And what I mean when I say that is that when we think of how psychotherapy works, it presumes a psychological mindedness, right? An ability to look inward and discover the true self. And it relies on that ability to have self-referential talk and self-reflection. This way of understanding the self may not be organic to many Native people. And so what we have to understand is that that idea of psychological mindedness is in itself a cultural prescription of Westernness. So that leads into that point, kind of what I said before, that as clinicians, we must acknowledge that clinical therapy is a cultural prescription. We are prescribing and working within this very colonial, Western, white way of understanding. And through that, we begin to experience therapy culture in a particular way. And what I mean when I say that is that this turn to modernity creates this preoccupation with emotional vulnerability, right? Where we begin to explore and experience it in very private spaces. We retreat into an interior realm. And what this may have a byproduct of is that it may inadvertently stigmatize the relationships we have not only between one another, but with ourselves and with our friends or our families, where we become to rely on the therapist for access into that emotional connection, right? By providing clients with that private person, which other people, which may lead to this idea of professional management and the extension of powerful interests, right? This might be an inadvertent product of that therapy culture, right? Mm-hmm. So therapy culture promises to fill the void left by modernity. People become fragmented and more alone than ever before, and then we kind of retreat into this internal space via therapy. So ultimately, what this means is that therapy, it leads to the question, is therapy best suited to redress the ills of Indigenous people, right? If all of these things comprise the idea of modernity, and psychotherapy is a product of modernity, are we then able to address the issues faced in our communities with colonial cultural prescriptions? Next slide. And so, in order to kind of get an idea of an alternative to adapting treatment, right? When we think about adapting, it's important to kind of talk about a few of these things that we have here on the slides, but also important to give the caveat that this isn't a black and white conversation, right? It's not tied up in this pretty bow where we can say, okay, do this, and now you can do therapy with Native people. It's more complicated. And as we reviewed the literature, there isn't this comfortable space in which we land when it comes to adapting treatment for Native people. However, the literature does give us some guidance. And one way we can do it is by restructuring our understanding of healing from an Indigenous way of knowing. And so here are some concepts when we're talking about alternatives to wellness from an Indigenous way of knowing. If we begin to start with the origin of problems, instead of looking at things from this biomedical, gene, physical, gene-based way of understanding, we begin to understand that the issues that our people face are a product of historical trauma, right? As that source of pervasive community disorder. So it positions dysfunction as this idea of trauma that has been intergenerationally passed down from community to community. And then we move on to talking about the norms of well-being. And what that means is that there has to be this restoration to forms of Indigenous ideas of selfhood and relationship, rather than this neoliberalist form of selfhood. And what I mean by neoliberalist forms of selfhood, I mean like as people experiencing themselves as free agents in a free market in pursuit of their own personal happiness, right? That very individualistic sense that we talked about earlier of selfhood. We instead have to be able to turn back to Indigenous ways of understanding one another in the context of this space. So then that leads to us talking about approaches to treatment, right? So we pursue this by reclaimed Indigenous traditional healing practices, especially ceremonial practices, right? As a means to restore the community, the community's wellness. And we view this in Native way as the most legitimate form of treatment rather than the implementation of established professional mental health procedures. And that includes evidence-based practice, which may be challenging for a lot of people watching this. But the point is that we position our traditional healing practices as the most legitimate form to address the issues of wellness in our communities. And so that leads to talking about the assessment of outcomes. And in line with talking about Indigenous ways of knowing, assessment then has to be positioned within those Indigenous ways of knowing too, where we turn to that knowledge for assessing the efficacy of treatment rather than what whiteness has privileged as the objective way to establish efficacy, namely clinical trials, scientific ideas of empiricism, right? So the way in which our people view efficacy, broadly speaking. Again, as Amanda said earlier, we don't speak for every Native community, but what you can find in the literature is a discussion of efficacy as a product of a healer's connection, not only with their community, but their connection with other than human beings, right? The people with which we ask for the intercession, right? To put it in colonial terms. That's how our people begin to assess efficacy, right? Broadly speaking, which is a very foreign concept to Western ways of knowing, and we can see how that clashes, right? So how might we get there? Okay, I'm not going to belabor this point because Amanda already touched a lot on this stuff, but we can look to community-based psychology to help kind of flip the script for what's going on in Native communities. And that encompasses everything that Amanda talked about, including collaboration, empowerment, prevention, diversity, context, and methodological pluralism, in that we're acknowledging Indigenous ways of knowing as legitimate forms of theorizing and legitimate sources of data that can include our very experiences and stories, which often get stomped on and viewed as lesser knowledge or not scientific or legitimate forms of knowledge.
So, we can do both of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm behind Michael right now. Hi. So ethical considerations to really wrap up our whole conversation we just had with you is the main one is to understand and recognize your biases. Now I know all of your professors told you understand your biases, and I'm gonna hit home, especially with Native people. Please do not see Native populations as populations that you need to fix. Understand that there's strength within Native tribal nations, and understand that you are there to work with their strengths, not give them strength. There's a lot of biases on non-Native individuals who do go into tribal nations to do therapy, that they're helping out. They're helping out the poor, privileged, or unprivileged individuals, that they're giving the knowledge that they need to be able to be individuals that can come and be, what's the word I'm thinking of? Be good. Lack of better terms, be good, be strong. That's the word I'm thinking of. Especially with all the implicit biases that you experience within the media, within just having interactions with Native people in general, on how Native populations are viewed as savages, sexualized beings, having trouble with the law, drunks, et cetera, et cetera. I could list off a whole list of stereotypes that just specifically encompasses tribal nations. So be aware of that. I cannot say it's enough. Be completely aware of this if you ever do work with an individual from the tribal nation. So the next one would be utilizing ceremony as a form of healing. It's really important that individuals understand that Native people, we were not allowed to fully express ourselves religiously / spirituality way until just as recent as 1978. It's so important that people understand that. So if you are coming in as a non-Native individual or a Native who don't really understand the traditional meanings of what it's like for that tribal nation, and you're like, oh yeah, let's go to a sweat, or oh yeah, let's go and smudge to help with your trauma. No, don't do that. That in itself is completely unethical. For one, you may not understand the tribal nation and their specific ways that they work through and heal traditionally. Two, and individuals who come from outside of their tribal nation who are telling them that they need to do these things, when in the whole history shows that they cannot do these things. You understand the complications that happen with that. And also three, you are completely inadequate to even have those conversations with people unless you know the ways and you work with the ways and you live by the ways. Another one would be changing the process of therapy. It's completely unethical to change. So we're talking about adaptation. If you do not know how to do that, please do not do that. Don't take this video like Amanda and Michael said this. Please do not do that. what we are saying is a broad overgeneralization for you to have an awareness of, not for you to put this into practice or for you to put this into place. Unless, and this is a big unless you are in the community for a long amount of time, you built those connections, you understand the traditional ways, you live by the traditional ways. Now, understanding and living is completely different concepts. And so if you can combine all those things together, then I would say you can consider adapting therapy for this population, as well as research on process of ceremony and mental health. If you do reach that point and you want to prove that this is the thing that's happening, it's kind of hard to do research in Indian country, which if you don't know about that, please Google it, because there are multiples of different situations where research in Indian country did not end well for Native people. And I mean, it's understandable why we don't like research and why we don't like individuals coming into our communities and doing these research type things. And so with all those things being said, the question is prompted of, should white individuals be working with Native American populations? And to be completely honest with you, from all the evidence that I gave you, that Michael gave you, and that I just reiterated right now, I do not think they should. White individuals coming into tribal nations and telling and working with individuals and telling them what they need to work on is just the repopulation of cycle of colonization and oppression and discrimination, racism, all the bad things, all the isms that happens whenever you're an outsider telling somebody what they need to do to be able to change. Anything else?
That sums it up.
That sums it up? Okay, so we're done. All that's left is questions.
I can check and see.
And I was too lazy to get up to switch the slide to questions. But we are done with our talk, so we'll open it up for everything else. Okay.
We have.
Okay. What does it say?
What are ways you think the field of psychology or organizations within the field can promote practices that benefit Indigenous communities, such as the practice of action research?
Okay. So what are ways you think the field of psychology? So the main thing is, I feel like I've said this like 6 times today, is to be able to go into the community, make those connections, and also have those conversations so that it's not you going in saying that this is what you're going to do. You know, honestly, sometimes Native communities, they understand the powerful, the power that white individuals who have academia behind them can bring to a tribal nation. And to be completely honest with you, if I was a white individual and the tribal nation asked me to like do research on, I don't know, how many toes, like whatever, I don't know, that's weird. But as an individual who wants to be aware of these things and who also wants to help, I would say that it's important that you take them up on their offer and you listen to them and you do it the way that they want it to be done. And you give them anything that you have with the research outcomes, you actually give them to them. There's a lot of research in the past and documentation of people who came in and did research and they did not give the research findings to the tribal nation and they just did whatever they wanted with it. So that's also very important. Working within the community, doing what the community wants you to do, and also giving them the product that they offer, that they asked you to give them.
Any other questions?
Oh.
What are some of the sources of resiliency within Native and Indigenous populations and communities, either based on your cultural expertise or the literature?
Do you want to do that one?
Do you have something?
Yeah, consider. What are some of the sources of resiliency? I mean, like, I would say the big resiliency within Native populations is just that we're alive.
Yeah.
I would say that would be like one of the major ones, that we're alive, we're living, we're moving through the earth, we're moving through land that people put us on to die. that I would say that is the major, biggest resiliency factor. The first thing that pops into my head.
Yeah, I echo that. I think that at the peak of colonization, 95% of our people were eradicated, and that's holistically. We're talking about, you know, so-called the United States of America, Canada, Mexico, but we're talking about holistically across the entire continent, our people's continent, right? And we are the survivors of 1% that made it through. We are the descendants of those 1%, right? And so we have found ways to begin to survive in a way that is thriving, right? So yes, we survive, but surviving isn't necessarily thriving, right? Mm-hmm. And so as we begin to push back, right? I'll use my own story, for example. As a Mexica person, the word Mexica is an indigenous word for what the colonizer would call Aztec people. We're still here, we survived. But that is a broad umbrella for a multitude of various different groups of people that fall under that umbrella that have been wiped out, right? I call myself Mexica because I can't go back far enough to know what those ways are. A lot of our people speak a language called Nahuatl, right, which is an indigenous language of Mexica folk. That wasn't the only language our people spoke. Very well, my language and my ceremonies and my ways may be gone. And the thing is that the way that Spaniards colonized my people, we experience a unique positionality in that there's been so much displacement of who we are. We've had our identities stolen and replaced with a bastardization of white identities. They call me Latino, they call me Hispanic, but nothing about me has to do with anything related to Latin or Latin countries. Nothing about me has to do with a Spanish language. Those are colonial markers of identity. Yet I still exist. And as much as whiteness has tried to take me and replace me with the goal of material gain, the taking of my resources, my people's resources, of my land, of my body, right? I resist simply by telling you, don't call me Latino, don't call me Hispanic. I'm Mexica, right? I'm Nicantlaca, I'm an indigenous person of this land, right? That is a piece of resiliency. The refusal to be defined by colonial markers of identity and speaking out against that in spite of the pull or the pressure to conform or to sink into comfort, to, you know, stop, to button up my shirt, right? To cut our hair, to abandon our languages, right? That is what resiliency looks like. That is what thriving looks like. Mm-hmm. That's when we're doing more than just surviving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Next question. Is there an indigenous theory might be used to support adapting treatments?
So there is a theory. There's one theory. And it is by Duran. What is Duran's first name?
Duran.
His name is Duran. We'll get you his first name. But it's called Soul Wound. And I'm not super familiar with it. I've only begun to really investigate what it is. But really, I mean, in a nutshell, and what I can tell you based on what I understand about Duran's Soul Wound approach, is that it positions therapy as ceremony, right? One of the issues with the Soul Wound approach, and I say this with a caveat that is probably the closest we've ever been able to get to positioning a therapy in relationship to indigenous ways of knowing, right? But what it draws on are Jungian psychoanalytic ideas of the collective unconscious, and more so Buddhist spirituality, right? But it does do a lot to move the idea of therapy from this idea of this secularized, individualistic Western idea and moves it to making psychotherapy a place for ceremony. What becomes difficult with that is it necessitates a spiritual connection that you as a clinician need to have. So where I sit right now in my own decolonization journey, I would not say that I am qualified to do such an approach. What one would need to do, and even if they didn't feel qualified or have that spiritual connection to be able to treat psychotherapy as ceremony, would be to A, refer to someone who can, or P, acknowledge that what you are doing in your traditional modes of therapy are at best colonizing, right? So yes, there are some theories. There is a theory. It doesn't completely answer the need, but it's done a really good job of it.
Also, there is a lot of we're in the work type things. I know Mr. Gone, the God Gone, if he's watching this, he's gonna laugh. That he is also working with different types of things, and but from the research that we've been looking for is that there hasn't been a particular kind of therapy or theory integrated with an indigeneity that actually produces, if that makes sense. Like, it's hard to do the research to figure out the outcomes of the theory that they're trying to embody and trying to work within the community. I know that there's a handful of them, but I haven't seen anything that was effective, quote unquote, which also brings us back to the thing that we're still trying to figure out how do we do that. We're still trying to figure out how do we work with that as well. Can you share some of the current Indigenous advocacy efforts you know of? Oh, okay. Oh, wait, first, Melinda, I just looked at this. Duran's first name is Eduardo, and his book is with Bonnie Duran, Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. It's not called Soul One, but it's the concept that they describe. Okay, so there we go. Thank you, Melinda. So current Indigenous advocacy efforts. Oh geez, what have we been doing lately? So we're in the process. I keep myself very busy. If you know me personally, you will know that I'm very busy. So we're currently in the process of trying to figure out how we can do a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Awareness Walk. So that would be for women, girls, and two-spirit individuals as well as boys. We're trying to figure out how to do that. Oklahoma is a little bit different than North Dakota, Avi, and how do we do that and go about that? We're still trying to get through the paperwork and things like that. We just did a talk last week to, what is it, Northeastern University? They had Northwestern, sorry, in Tahlequah. They had a Celebrating Indigenous Women's conference, and we were able to speak at that as well. And really just have a conversation about like, what do we do and different things like that, like MMIW stuff. So that's what we've been doing here, as well as this is advocacy work. And this is what we've been doing in Oklahoma so far. North Dakota, I was with a lot of really driven individuals as well as I am. There's like a really good handful of us, and we were able to do like an online media campaign. We were able to do a big awareness walk, as well as display the media campaign all over the campus, doing multiple talks and being able to make a bigger community and a bigger network so that we're all able to connect to each other and try to work together to help fight this and combat this. As well as that, also, yay, 2018, there was a lot of Native women who actually went to politics and they won. Yes. My bias, I think the world is better with Native women in charge. And so there was also many bills that went through, particularly with North Dakota. I know that there was at least 3 of them, specifically with missing and murdered Indigenous women, and how do we help train and make those connections and communications between the tribal core entities, tribal police, that's the word I'm thinking of, as well as with the state and federal, and how we do that and do different things like that, as well as trying to figure out how we can do prevention. I know that Deb
whenever she got to Congress, that was one of the things that she really wanted. She's honing in on is missing and murdered Indigenous women, and how do we do that? How do we make sure that our communities are safe? Yeah.
So we have 5 more minutes. Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you guys all so much for attending this, listening to us, being aware, and also soaking in the information so that you are able to be better individuals / clinicians whenever you're working with Indigenous populations.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Oh, wait.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Michael. Sorry to scare you there. Just wanted to say thank you, and also let everyone know that the recording of this webinar will be made available so that you all have it to share with others who were not able to attend and continue to pass on this very important information.
Please be aware. Okay. We got more literature to read.
Yeah, more stuff to read.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution.
Yes, thank you, Gail. Okay.